cold house. The windshield wipers were choking. Large flakes of snow, the car roared, spinning its wheels through the wet white mass. The guy put the gear in neutral and leaned back in the seat. There were about 100 kilometers left to Orenburg. He drove most of the way and flew into a ditch when the car lost traction. Andrey pulled on his hat, gloves, and went outside. All around there was a motionless, transparent and brittle, like glass, silence. The gray sky was pouring snow, lazily overtaking the monochromatic clouds. The guy looked at the Nissan and realized that he would not be able to leave this place without outside help. The front part of the car sank up to the hood, branches of some bush stuck out of the snowdrift. The guy turned around, looking hopelessly at the dark track he had left behind as he flew down to the side of the road with curses and even further, until the car finally got stuck. He sat back in the car, rubbing his instantly frozen hands, and took out his mobile phone. The clock showed 3:30. It gets dark early in winter. He needed to get out as soon as possible. The polite girl on the other end of the line said that the road was covered in snow and the tow truck would arrive only in the morning, or maybe even later, everything for them. For the people on the other end of the line, spending time in warmth and comfort depended on the circumstances. At that moment, the guy felt some kind of vague anxiety. He was a city dweller, accustomed to a working phone at hand, and the mere thought that he would run out of gas and the cold would squeeze the life out of him drop by drop, like toothpaste from a tube, made his hands tremble. He hadn't heard the storm warning. The snowfall had started when he had already driven a decent distance away from the city, and in a couple of hours it had turned the road into an endless snowy mess. Andrey dialed the rescuer's number. An ordinary SUV would have been enough for him to pull out his baby and continue on his way. Another polite girl indifferently said that they would, of course, try to do everything possible, but most likely they would have to wait until the morning. "It is impossible to get to you now," she said syllable by syllable, as if Andrey were a 7-year-old child. "I advise you to look around. There are many populated areas near the highway. Maybe you are near one of them." "Thank you," he whispered in a low voice and lowered his hand with the mobile phone onto his knees. The snowy silence pressed on all sides, and the music coming from the speakers with a hoarse, broken voice could not enliven it. There is a silence, with an icy taste of loneliness, which neither music nor a human shout can break. Andrey was not going to give up. He tried again and again to get out on the road. The car roared like a mad beast, snow fell on the hot hood and immediately melted, covering the metal with an icy crust. The storm with cold-blooded calm wrapped the car, lulled its driver. About an hour passed. The guy was breathing heavily, then he screamed loudly and pressed the horn with all his might. A piercing scream fell on the deserted area, reflected from the rare trees, scattering into fragments somewhere in the arms of the transparent horizon. There was no point in sitting inside. Andrey glanced at the fuel gauge. The arrow was trembling somewhere in the middle. The guy quickly gathered his things in a bag, looked around the interior just in case, and again found himself outside. The temperature was rapidly falling. Thick steam was coming out of his mouth. "Where should I go now?" the driver whispered, wrapping himself tighter in a wide scarf. His clothes were not suitable for long walks over rough terrain knee-deep in snow. A leather jacket, a shirt, a simple knitted hat and a long woolen scarf were good for keeping him warm in the car, but not outside. Andrey climbed a small hill to get a good look at the area, and although the area was drowning in a swirl of white flakes, somewhere in the distance, behind a sparse strip of birches and maples, The slanted houses of some village were visible. Taking one last look at the car, the guy headed there. He moved his freezing legs with difficulty. The snow was getting into his boots, the wind was getting stronger, hitting his face with prickly ice chips. By the time Andrey reached the village, it had probably been about half an hour. The sky was gradually darkening, the bluish twilight was descending, lengthening the shadows, urging the lonely lost man on. Only when he was very close, about 20 paces away, did the traveler realize that he had not come to a village at all. Here and there the remains of some buildings were black. Sharp sticks of falling fences were sticking out of the snow-white mess, and only one house remained intact. It was small, with one floor and an attic, where an open window was slamming, echoing the crazy movements of the northern wind. Despite this, the path to the door was either trodden or cleared. Andrey raked the snow that had fallen from above with his boot and loudly knocked on the door with his fist. Silence served as his answer, only the howling of the wind could be heard somewhere above. The guy waited a little, knocked again and froze, listening. Quiet. This did not cause any surprise. Everyone knows that here and there on the territory of Russia there are abandoned villages and settlements, where no one has lived for many years. Andrey did not hesitate any longer, pushed the door, and it opened easily, revealing the black insides of an abandoned dwelling. The roar of the wind died away somewhere behind him. The sunlight, dripping drop by drop, made its way through the covered windows, outlining the contours of old things with cold reflections. It was a large square room, like in many old houses, filled with ancient furniture. A low bed, neatly made with a patchwork bedspread, huddled against the far wall. A rough wooden table stood right by the window. Bunches of some herbs hung from the ceiling. Here and there on the shelves and boxes one could see cloudy jars and boxes with unknown contents. But none of this mattered, because right in the center, towering over all this mess like a white giant, was the stove. Andrey, as if possessed, rushed to it, rubbing his frozen red palms. Inside, the stove was dry, although it had not been used for quite a long time. The guy looked around, wondering whether to break and burn one of the sturdy chairs. But then he remembered the cleared path to the door and decided that it was not worth ruining relations with the possible owner of the house. He quickly broke off long sticks from a slanted fence on the street and in a few minutes was sitting on the floor, holding his hands to the still small, but already hot and so familiar fire. The guy took off his frozen jacket and put it on the stove so that it warmed up and dried. Considering the number of abandoned buildings outside, the heat would last until the morning and even longer. Andrey exhaled, leaning his back against the already warm stove. "It's not that bad," he said contentedly, taking off his wet boots. Outside, a snowstorm was raging in white flakes. The wind was beating the snow against the walls and windows, rushing into the house somewhere upstairs, in the attic. And inside, on the first floor, the fire was creaking and hissing, crunching the still damp wood cheerfully, filling the whole room with hot orange warmth. Steam stopped coming out of his mouth. The guy resisted the fatigue that had fallen on him for a while, which always happens when you get very cold outside, but gradually his strength left him. And he dropped his head onto his chest and dozed off. Andrey shuddered when some loud sound in the attic tore him out of his pleasant slumber. It was an unclosed window slamming. It was also letting in both an icy draft and a winter wind. The guy stretched contentedly, loosening his numb bones, and headed for the stairs. The first step creaked loudly, bending under the guest's weight, and the entire staircase, assembled from simple wooden blocks, was shaking. It looked like it was about to fall apart. The attic was a small, dark room with one bed by the window and some boxes piled up in a heap in the corner. The guy turned on the backlight on his mobile phone so as not to trip over the old junk, and was dumbfounded. The flickering light snatched from the darkness, as if it had pulled out of the grave, a thin, stiff corpse lying on the bed. Andrey cursed, stepping back until his back hit the cold wall. The window slammed again, and the guy shuddered, almost dropping his mobile phone. He collected his thoughts for a while, but then took a deep breath and came closer. In the end, what's the big deal? An old man lived alone in an abandoned village and died, or froze to death, the guest muttered, carefully approaching the terrible find. A second later, all his thoughts seemed to evaporate. An old man, skinny to the point of stupefaction, with his belly stuck to his spine, lay on the bed. Transparent, like parchment, snow-white skin let through the shadows of blood vessels, the outlines of bones and muscles. His mouth was open, the backlight reflected off yellowed crooked teeth, and empty eye sockets were visible on his face like black resin pits. The guy swallowed, and this sound seemed incredibly loud in the ensuing silence. He quickly closed the window and hurried back to the first floor. There he climbed onto the stove, covering himself with his already dry jacket, and for some reason pressed a heavy poker to his chest. He did not want to meet the owner of the house at all, if he was still alive, without a weapon. The house was plunged into winter silence. The flame danced playfully in the mouth of the stove, creating bunches of bizarre sharp shadows all over the room. Andrey fancied he could smell the smell of wet warm wood and hay. The village hut had already warmed up completely, and without an open window it was even getting hot in the attic. The guy felt a large Snickers bar in his bag, ate it with gusto, leaving half for tomorrow. He had already closed his eyes, deciding to doze a little more, when some sound upstairs made him shudder. Through the thick rotten ceilings, diluted by the quiet crackling of the fire, shuffling steps were clearly audible. What the hell? There was no doubt that the creepy old man without eyes was dead. However, someone or something was moving there, among the abandoned boxes, with a shuffling heavy gait. Andrey squeezed the poker so hard that his knuckles turned white. His mouth was dry, his heart was counting the seconds madly. It seemed that even the blizzard had frozen outside the window. The creature had stopped for a while. But very soon the guy's strained ears heard the terrible, heart-rending creak of the stairs. They were shaking from side to side, the loose beams seemed about to fall apart. Crash! The last step broke, and then, a blow. Something heavy fell to the floor and remained there, moving its limbs, brittle yellowish nails scraping the floor, leaving furrows on it. Andrey could smell the smell of dusty decay in some herbs, quietly spreading throughout the room. Sweetish to the point of nausea, it filled his lungs, which made him want to take a long breath. He wanted to expel this cloying aroma from his chest. The guy's gaze darted from corner to corner, when the hunched figure of an old man appeared in the narrow doorway. Dressed in old pants with patches, he stumbled into the room, bending forward like an ugly doll. It was obvious that each step was difficult for him. His thin arms clung to the walls and furniture, dragging his skeletal body forward. The corpse turned its head with the remnants of gray hair, as if trying to get its bearings. It sucked air through its nose, and a whistling sound, echoing the blizzard outside the window, rushed through the room, reflected off the wooden walls in the oppressive village silence. The sweet smell of rotting bones became unbearable. Andrey watched this picture, afraid to move. It seemed that the corpse was looking for something. It stopped, turning its disfigured face to the stove, on which sat a guest white as paper. The black holes of the eye sockets acquired a meaningful expression. Who lit the stove? his sedan open mouth with rows of crooked teeth. Who lit the stove? The old man sobbed, turning away to the window. At that very moment, Andrey, with an agility uncharacteristic of him, jumped forward, kicking his boot into the skinny spine. A deafening crunch filled the room. The dead body was thrown to the floor. Ech. The corpse lay there, its arms twisted unnaturally at the joints, the puzzled expression of the open mouth frozen forever on its eerie face. Andrey lowered the poker, trying to catch his breath. He gently kicked the old man with the toe of his boot, wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked around in confusion. If he had to stay here until the morning, he had to get rid of this bag of bones. The guy opened the door and kicked the corpse out onto the porch. It turned out to be incredibly light, as if there was nothing left inside except fragile bones. The door slammed loudly, shaking off the snow that had fallen from his shirt. The guy exhaled slowly. Your mother, he whispered, taking out a pack of cigarettes with shaking hands. Half an hour ago, smoking in someone else's house seemed wrong, and now everything that was happening seemed so absurd. A cruel and indistinct game of either imagination or some dark forces. Having taken a drag, Andrey climbed onto the stove again, from where he could see deep furrows on the floor left by nails and large pieces of skull bone scattered here and there. Now he chose this place not because it was the warmest, but because it was the safest. There was a reliable wall behind him, and the height of the stove allowed him to see the entire room, while remaining in the dark. If it weren't for the blizzard, if it weren't for -30 outside, the guy would have left this damned place long ago. He suddenly imagined himself quickly pacing the ice field. Now he was among the thick trunks of birches. Now he could hear the sound of the car door opening. Ignition. The car hummed pliantly, ready to take its owner anywhere. And everything that happened will turn out to be a dream, or a stupid joke, or just one of those incidents that you don't tell anyone about and that only at night, in your lonely nightmares, pops up in your memory again. In the morning, he said quietly, pressing the poker. Naturally, the guy couldn't fall asleep again, and he probably didn't want to. Whoever appeared in this godforsaken place would meet worthy resistance. The hours dragged on slowly, as if they too were frozen in this terrible cold. The mobile phone display showed 3:20. How nice it would be to distract himself with some stupid game, plant a couple of bushes on a virtual farm, and then, lo and behold, a rescue car would appear on the horizon. But he couldn't waste his battery. So Andrey sat in silence, only occasionally checking the time and throwing wood into the stove. That's probably why he was able to discern the creak of footsteps somewhere behind the door. Do you want more? The guy grinned maliciously, jumping up from his seat and pulling on his jacket. As soon as he said these words, the door swung open as if someone strong and big had hit it from the other side. An icy wind blew into the room, showering everything with snow crumbs, and amidst the mad streams of the storm, the guy managed to make out a low figure. Wrapped in black rags, it immediately slipped inside with incredible dexterity and, without a single touch, made the heavy oak door close with a deafening roar. It was not an old man. It seemed that the creature had no gender or age. Short, about 1.5 meters to the very top of its head, it stared at the guest with an unblinking gaze. A long, pointed nose crowned a wrinkled, old face, on which tiny beady eyes burned with a cold flame. Cracked lips stretched into a menacing grin, the light of the fire reflected from rows of sharp teeth and retreated, as if frightened. "Oh, you scoundrel!" The creature screamed, pointing a gnarled stick at Andrey's chest. He was taken aback at first, but only for a second. And already in his swing of the poker, an invisible force dealt a crushing blow to the chest. The ribs crunched like paper, the guy's body was thrown back, hit the stove, and immediately a sharp pain pierced his lower back, ran along the spine, leaving no opportunity to breathe. He had never been an athlete or sportsman. He sat in the office on the phone, and in the evenings he drank beer in a familiar bar, but now, shaking from adrenaline euphoria. The guy quickly rose to his feet and, in a couple of seconds, covered the entire room, fell out into the street through the window. The wind hit him in the face, laughed with a piercing howl, swirling a snow whirlwind around the frightened man. Andrey, without looking back, ran wherever his gaze fell. As soon as he left the house, the forest grew around him like a threatening wall of thick trunks. And of course the guy understood that when he came here in the morning, there was a field around, and in the distance small deciduous trees huddled. Now, unfriendly pines looked out from the darkness with shaggy paws, clinging to his jacket, as if they cared about what was happening. Andrey ran forward, sinking into the snow. He left his gloves and hat in the house and did not want to go back for them. Run. Don't look back. You can't win. Broken ribs turned every step into unbearable pain, breaths became hoarse, gurgling with hot blood somewhere in the very center of the chest. The guy could no longer run. He wandered forward, lost and stunned by the blow of a strange creature. He saw the gleam of tiny unblinking eyes in the shadows of the branches. He heard the creaking of footsteps behind him. This creature was watching him. It wasn't angry, didn't try to get closer, realizing that time was on its side. What are you? What do you want? Hugh whispered with frozen lips and, leaning against the rough trunk of a pine tree, realized that he had no strength left to walk. The guy raised his head to the sky, but the stars were not visible because of the wind and snow. He really wanted to see a clear sky. He spat bloody saliva on the snow and wiped his mouth with a rough sleeve. Right above him, head down, clinging to the trunk with long fingers with sharp nails, sat the owner of the creepy dwelling. He watched the man with an unblinking gaze, as if expecting something inevitable. And of course Andrey understood what exactly. "Fuck you," he said hoarsely, grinning. The heart slowed down, like a broken clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. Slower and slower it pumped the freezing water in the freezing body. The pain gradually disappeared, as if it was feeding on the warmth, as if it was drinking hot blood, which was losing degree after degree every second. The guy looked straight into the creature's eyes and saw a silent sentence in their gloomy gleam. Darkness surrounded him from all sides, lulling him, rocking his broken body on the scorching hands of the storm. He really wanted to sleep. Tick. Tock. Tick. He opened his eyes with difficulty, and his gaze fell upon the familiar log ceiling of the damned hut. It was quiet and light, the sun was beating its rays through the snow-covered windows, but it gave no warmth. The house was covered in snow, the stove had long since been choked by water and wind. The guy tried to move his limb, but it didn't work, his body, frozen to the bone, did not obey him. There was no pain either. No sensations at all. Only cold. Someone was fussing nearby. Andrey squinted, trying to see what was happening. Everything was in a fog, as if reality was covered with a translucent plastic film. "You came into a stranger's house, lit someone else's stove," maimed the guard. A voice creaked somewhere under his ear. "And you wanted to run away without answering?" "No, my dear, that doesn't happen. You will have to answer for everything." That same incomprehensible creature, wrapped in black rags, was tearing his shirt with its nails, freeing the man's pale body from clothes. The guy wanted to say something, but his tongue froze to the roof of his mouth. The creature smiled from ear to ear, revealing small sharp teeth. It was high time to replace Petrovich. The creature said cheerfully. "He was really bad." With these words, long fingers dug into the skin, as if with a scalpel making a neat cut from the ribs to the navel. The man felt sick out of habit and heard the frantic echo of his frozen heart. Was it still beating? Really? Please, let it be true. Knock. 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 No sound. The chest had frozen, having taken its last breath back then, among the black giant pines. The last breath, filled with crumbs of an ice storm. Suddenly, somewhere in the area of the sternum, Andrey felt a flash of pain. Is it the heart? It, my dear, is still alive, still trying to disperse the cold blood through the body. He opened his eyes wide when hard fingers grabbed something inside his body. Andrey shuddered. It did not hurt, but it was as if only at that moment he realized the reality of his own death. The creature with a wide grin took out from the mutilated stomach a large lump of muscles and vessels, which hung like torn tubes all the way to the elbow. There it is. No more sound. No breath. Only at that moment, when the sunlight painted the organ with an orange glow, Andrey fully realized what was happening. Just a day ago, he, a warm and cheerful, a real living person, was packing a bag for a trip. He was going to his mother in Nuremberg, to visit an old woman. For some reason he remembered a rustling Snickers bar in a shiny wrapper, his mother's face, the voices of some people. Just a day ago he was alive, and now some creature was taking him apart like a pig carcass in a butcher shop. The room was filled with the smell of fresh blood, which seemed to have saturated even the old boards of the dwelling with a viscous aroma, forever imprinting incredible human fear on each log. When the creature finished, it wiped its hands on the rags like a proprietor, shoved bunches of some dried herbs into Andrey's stomach and, taking out a long shiny needle, began to carefully sew it up. The guy didn't want to look anymore. He stared at the ceiling, swaying from the movements of experienced hands. Tears flowed from his eyes, immediately freezing on his cheeks in tiny pieces of ice. "Well, that's good," the creature croaked. "Give him your eyes." An old man with empty eye sockets immediately appeared before the man's eyes, rising from the snowy darkness. Andrey gathered all his strength into a fist and shook his head, muttering something unintelligible. "Don't be so sulky," the owner of the house sighed. "If I leave you with eyes or internal organs, flies will eat you in the summer. It will be even worse. But like this, you'll dry out and that's it." Andrey moaned, trying to move his frozen body. Even his bones were filled with despair and fear. He would never see the sun again. He would never see. Crunch. Darkness. All of reality thudded, fell and shattered in eternal darkness. Andrey wanted to scream, and he screamed as best he could, but only quiet wheezing came from somewhere in his chest. "Listen to me carefully," a voice that seemed to be coming from everywhere sternly said. "Why lights winter, you sleep peacefully until some fool lights the stove." A chuckle. "And when the spring drips, I'll sleep, and you'll guard my peace. And watch out, if anyone wakes you up, you'll regret it very much. You're lying there, it doesn't hurt, does it?" And I can make it hurt. Got it, kid? The boy didn't know if he understood or not, and he especially didn't understand how to answer the question. The creature outside continued to scurry around somewhere to the right, the sounds gradually dying down until his consciousness plunged into endless darkness.